So yeah, woodlands and trees, obviously a key part of forest school. And when the qualification was first developed, bizarrely, there wasn't much content in there on woodlands or trees. That was partly because it was developed through Bridgewater College and it was in the early years setting, and they were using an outdoor space with trees, but they were very much focusing on the learning and the play and that side of things. So the first iteration, I suppose, of the qualification 20 odd years ago, or 15, 20 years ago, didn't have loads in there about woodlands and trees. But over the years, bits have been added in because, yeah, obviously people realised it's key. Sometimes people end up, like you've got Ellie, you're up in a proper woodland and you have to sort of manage it and look after it. So you need a certain amount of knowledge to look after your space. But whatever space you're using with trees in it, you kind of need to know, I suppose, for various reasons why, you know, what trees you've got, what's growing there, how that might inform your practice and how that might make you think in terms of safety. So obviously early on in forest school, when the key objectives went down that then have been taken up by the Forest School Association, quite early on it said that forest school should take place in a woodland. They then revised that to an area with trees because some people are saying, well, we're kind of in a park, it's not really a woodland. So I think the key thing is trees really help. If you're in a field or you're in a small garden without any trees, you're going to struggle. And obviously the more trees and the more variety you've got, the more wildness you've got, essentially, the easier in many ways it is to do forest school. But obviously it helps over time if you build your knowledge and your experience of what's growing and what to look out for. Seasonal changes, which we've been talking about, which has been great. You know, looking at fungi coming up, that can be a great way to sort of support your practice and think, oh, great, it's the time of year when all the leaves are going to fall off. We could do loads of mandalas or mosaics using leaves, or, oh, this is the time of year that mushrooms turn up, so maybe we'll do something on photography around mushrooms or drawing mushrooms. So yeah, obviously having some knowledge around that seasonal cycle can be you know, can be quite useful. So we had a little look. A few of you held up some nice little objects. So there's a few things on here from various sort of native trees. Obviously there's fruit trees. This is part of a slide that I used before when I was doing assemblies with children and asking them to think about, you know, what is it that grows on trees that might be of interest to both people and wildlife, and what sort of trees might we find. So starting to look at some common shaped leaves that they might be familiar with. So the nice one in the middle, a lot of children are fairly familiar with an oak tree, which is nice. I'm fairly familiar with acorns. That's quite good. That's quite a good starting point, I think, with a lot of children, is when you're looking at what they can find on the woodland floor, is starting to ask them, oh, you know, what do we think these are, and what part of the tree do they belong to, and you know, why are they important from the tree's point of view and maybe other wildlife's point of view. So children will have often come across conkers. Conkers are great little treasures to pick up, and chestnuts, as we were looking at a minute ago as well. Sweet chestnuts. You've got sweet chestnuts with a very spiky shells, which are super spiky, and then you've got horse chestnut. Both of those aren't strictly native. The sweet chestnut is slightly more native in that it's found commonly in a lot of Europe. Both of them are very naturalized, so they're quite common. So horse chestnut, conkers, as we generally call them, were introduced because they got very nice flowers, so they're very nice big flowers, and they're quite nice. You know, people liked collecting them. There was a fad for collecting trees going back a long way, going back a few hundred years, from people that had large grounds and big houses and wanted to show off to their friends that they had the latest tree from China or wherever it was. So a lot of these trees got planted a few hundred years ago, and they've become fairly naturalized, you know, in that they quite like the climate, generally speaking, and they grow quite well in the UK. So yeah, we've got some trees that are less sort of native and natural, but they're, you know, commonplace now, including sycamore, though there's not a proper sycamore leaf on there. Oh no, there is a sycamore leaf on there. There we go. That one there. Sorry. Yeah, there is a sycamore. So sycamore again, sort of introduced from Southern Europe, but quite a long time ago, probably by the Romans. And then we've got a type of maple there. Again, might not be native, but we do have a native maple tree. We have a field maple, which the leaf doesn't quite look as good as that, but it does turn a nice colour. So we got, yeah, a good range of trees that we might come across with our groups. And we can start getting them to think about the seeds and the berries and the different things that might grow on trees. And obviously, from our point of view, obviously fruits can be quite interesting as well at certain points in the year. So quite a lot, yeah, quite a lot to sort of draw your groups in on. And often when I'm kind of talking to groups about trees, I'll sort of, obviously it depends a little bit on their, oops, sorry, gone too far, a little bit on their age in terms of their awareness around the importance of trees. But a lot of, you know, a lot of primary school children will have a good sense of, oh, they're quite important trees, aren't they? And they may be quite important for wildlife. Maybe they're important. Some of them might know that some medicines come from trees. And obviously that a lot of them will be aware, because you'll end up doing a fire probably at some point, that firewood can be quite important. And trees, the moss, yeah, moss, coming back to moss, which is quite a good point to highlight, I suppose. In if we kind of look at that top right corner, really lush, vivid picture of some woodland with lots of moss and things growing up the trunks of the trees. Looking at it more closely, I'm not 100% convinced that's a native woodland, but anyway, we'll ignore that for the time being. It's a good indicator when you've got lots of moss and lichens and things growing on the bark, growing on the side of trees. It's a really good indicator that the air is quite clean. And obviously trees contribute towards that a lot themselves, in that they actively clean the air and they trap pollution on their leaves. So a lot of our street trees, a lot of our urban trees are chosen specifically for that job. So trees like the plane tree, which has a very large leaf and also has flaky bark as well, that traps pollution, air pollution really well, and it's trapped on the leaves and on the bark. So yeah, trees are important for all those reasons, and for preventing flooding as well, and managing water flow, as well as supporting wildlife, as I kind of mentioned before. So yeah, lots of reasons to kind of highlight the benefit of trees and woodlands to your groups, and lots of interesting relationships as well, and unusual relationships. This time of year, maybe a bit earlier as well, maybe sort of a few months ago, slightly easier, as the acorns have been falling off. There's been a lot of acorns this year. It's a really good year for acorns. Occasionally amongst the acorns, you'll find some of these. So some of them will look like marbles, like that one there, and some of them will look much more outlandish and alien, like this hedgehog gall. And these are all to do with this tiny, tiny wasp. It's not a wasp that will sting. It's a teeny tiny wasp about the size of a grain of rice. And it lays its egg into the bud of the oak tree. And then it will grow itself a home, essentially, or for its babies. So it will lay its eggs into there, and the tree will grow a gall. And the gall will be specific to the type of wasp. And then the little babies in the gall will munch away into little kind of caterpillary grubs. And eventually they'll cut a little hole out and they'll fly off. So you get these amazing relationships that we generally don't see and we aren't aware of, but very occasionally children will come across these on the woodland floor and they'll go, oh, what's that? And it's a really nice relationship, a really interesting one. It doesn't do much harm to the tree. Obviously an acorn doesn't end up growing from that sort of bud, and the leaf doesn't grow in quite the same way, but it doesn't really do much harm to the oak tree at all. And you get these amazing little wasps flying around. And obviously there are other relationships. We talked about fungi. Fungi really important in terms of recycling the nutrients in woodland. So a woodland is basically dependent on that whole recycling process. That's really key. And we need to leave as much dead wood that's safe. So obviously if it's a big tall tree that's dying, that needs to be cut down smaller so it's not going to fall on anyone. But leaving dead wood on the floor and dead wood that's standing, that's safe, is really important in woodlands. So a stag beetle, for example, great stag beetle, their larvae can take up to 7 years of munching away inside a rotting log before they're ready to hatch out as the stag beetle form. So you need some good rotten wood to support that type of wildlife. And obviously woodpeckers really, they need, that is what they need. They need standing dead wood to peck their holes in and to look for food in, as do other birds as well. And lots of different types of fungi, so many types of fungi. General rule at forest school for me is encouraging children to look at the fungi, but generally not touch it. There are, as I kind of mentioned earlier, there are some fungi that's very poisonous, but generally fungi that's growing on trees in that way isn't as poisonous. So it tends to be the toadstools, or the kind of more mushroom-like looking fungi that grow on the ground, that can be the more poisonous ones. So the ones on trees are a little bit safer in that aspect, in terms of like the jelly ear that we were talking about earlier. So yeah, lots of kind of good wildlife relationships to highlight. So the jay, anyone want to have a guess? How many acorns do you think a jay buries every year? So the jay is a woodland bird. It's got quite a squawky call. It's got beautiful feathers that occasionally you'll find on the woodland floor, and it gathers up acorns in the autumn and hides them in the ground for its winter feeding, a bit like squirrels do. Anyone want to have a guess? How many acorns? Come on, feel free, shout out. Have a shout. You'll have to unmute yourself then. Or you could hold up fingers.
150.
150. Well, Deborah, good first. More than that. So more than 150. So go on, someone else, have a guess.
500.
500. Oh, you were going in the right direction, but there's a lot. Yeah, quite a lot more. Quite a lot more.
1,000.
All right. Okay, we're getting close. We're getting close. Thanks, Annie. About 5,000. So every autumn they bury about 5,000 acorns all over the place, and obviously they forget. I always say to children, if they had a bag of sweets and they took a bit, well, it'd be a sack of sweets, wouldn't it, if it's 5,000 sweets, and they went all over there where they lived, the area they lived, and hid them all, would they be able to remember where they hid them all? And they'd probably say no, but they might have eaten them all already. Whereas the jay is burying them for the winter, for when it's hungry. And obviously it forgets where a lot of them are. So a lot of them rot, a lot of them get eaten by mice or other animals, squirrels. But quite a few every year will start growing as little trees. And the ones that grow specifically, that grow in like bramble patches and inaccessible spots. Bramble's really good because it keeps deer and it'll keep rabbits out and things like that. Those might grow into big trees, and obviously oak trees can live for a very long time, as we know. So yeah, we are going to run out of time shortly, so I'll log back in. So trees can look after themselves. Trees can defend themselves. Obviously, we know they can defend themselves. They've got thorns. Some trees are very thorny. I think that's blackthorn at the top, which has some of the biggest thorns, which are the nastiest from our point of view. So that will keep things off from eating its leaves. The caterpillar there, anyone want to guess what's going on with the caterpillar? So we've got some funny little wavy lines coming off the leaves. The caterpillar's having a good old munch. Anybody want to guess at what those dotted lines are about?
It's sending chemical signals to neighbouring trees.
It is sending chemical signals, and it sort of is picked up by neighbouring trees, but it's also picked up by something else as well. So what those chemical signals can be picked up by is birds have learned to identify the chemical signals that come off a tree that's under attack by caterpillars. So essentially the tree is calling for help. It's saying, look, I've got a load of caterpillars on me. And at certain times in the year, you can get caterpillars can come out in big numbers on oak trees and on other trees. And if all those caterpillars survived, they would actually do a bit of damage to the oak tree, because it would be quite a setback from the tree's point of view to grow loads more leaves. But they will do. But it will be, in health-wise, it'll be a setback. So the tree releases some chemicals. So some trees will pick up on that smell, like if it's the same tree, or it will make the leaves taste more bitter to the caterpillar. So that's its first line of defense. And its second line of defense is to, call the birds in, essentially call the cavalry in to come and eat some of the caterpillars. So a lot of birds will come in, recognizing that the caterpillars have triggered a response and that there's caterpillars about to be eaten. So things like blue tits in particular will come in and eat some of those caterpillars. So the final one here, so we were talking about coppicing. So coppicing is an interesting phenomena. So most of our native deciduous trees, so trees that drop their leaves in the winter, so our deciduous trees like these, I think there's a mixture there probably of ash and maybe some sycamore. Hazel as well, Ellie mentioned about hazel. It's that they have learned, well, the trees have developed the ability to grow back when they get cut or broken off at the base. So they've obviously, you know, people have cottoned onto this a long time ago. People cottoned onto that probably, well, you know, sort of hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of years ago. People cottoned onto the fact that if you cut trees back, you get nice smaller bits of wood growing. And sometimes those smaller bits of wood are more useful from the point of view of making charcoal, making products that you might use like fencing, panels, and for firewood as well. So historically, people were more interested in smaller bits of wood rather than big tree trunks. But obviously, the trees developed that ability well before people came on the scene. So possibly as the cliffhanger before the time runs out. Anyone want to guess what animal caused, or you could be more than one animal if you want, but what animals, so we're talking thousands of years ago, encouraged trees to develop that ability to regrow? Anyone want to have a guess? So we're talking more than 10,000 years ago, so pre-Ice Age.
Mammoths.
Mammoths, yeah. So mammoths and elephants. So you've only got to go back 50,000 years, which sounds like a long time, but it's not that long. And we had elephants, a European elephant, and it would have been breaking off bits of these trees. And the trees that could regrow were the ones that survived. So those are the ones that kept going. So we are going to get cut off. I'm going to, so yeah, if you want to have a go at logging back in a second, and we will carry on and finish those slides off. So log back in on the same code, and I will see you in a second. It will carry on. All these intricate relationships between trees and their roots and the fungal partners that they have. And it's basically a big cooperative sharing system that is going on under the ground. That trees, particularly trees that are related, will share resources. So in a year, if a tree has a major attack of caterpillars, or it gets damaged by browsing animals, it might struggle that year, and it will share its related neighbours will share resources via the roots. So they'll share the food that they've harvested via photosynthesis via the roots to support the tree that might be ill or struggling. And similarly, when trees are small, so when you've got tiny trees that are, you know, they could be the children of a larger tree, the parent, the mother tree will support its children essentially to keep them alive, because until a tree gets its canopy fully up, until it's up, which Ellie will see a lot in the woodland that she's in up at Cathedral School, you've got the really big trees forming the canopy at the top, and they will shade out trees underneath. So if a tree's not getting light, it's going to die off. But a parent tree or mother tree can help keep them going. So when a gap does appear, because eventually trees fall over or get blown over, or they die or get diseased, then that's the opportunity then for those smaller trees to kind of spring up and get out into the canopy. So yeah, lots of different things going on. And obviously the things that we want to draw our groups into is things like conkers. So everyone played conkers? I played conkers. Everyone played conkers when they were children? Most people played conkers. So some schools, all sorts of madness went on maybe 10 years ago. Some schools banning conkers and everyone getting a bit worried about conkers. But generally, from the point of view, the health and safety executive did a great little thing where they said conkers represent a minimal, if in, you know, unmeasurable risk. There's no risk from conkers. Although I did have someone come on some training once who said they almost got blinded by a conker once, but then when we went into a bit more detail about what had happened, they said their friend had thrown a conker at their face. So that was slightly different. So I think that was more of a behavioural issue rather than a conker issue. So yeah, conker's a great way to draw your groups in and get them being playful and looking at what comes off trees at different times of year and how they might use those. And crafts, again, we're talking about this, great time of year, looking at how you can use leaves and different materials from trees. Any time of the year is good, really, but the autumn can be particularly good for finding different colours. Some people kind of really go to town on that with the whole sort of mandala idea, I suppose, looking at creating patterns and shapes and that kind of thing, and seeing what they can find, and conkers can be great for that. And I think there's been a resurgence in the whole idea of the nature table at schools, which is great, having sort of seasonal tables where children will be encouraged to bring things in they found and talk a bit about that as well, which is great, like we've done today, which has been really nice to hear. There we go. That's fading slowly. And so, yeah, and just encouraging children to be playful, I guess, relating to what the space you've got. And sometimes the reality of that in some schools and some spaces is you need to bring in materials. You might need to bring in poles of wood and sometimes leaves that you've picked up on a walk that you've had at the weekend. And that's fine. That's okay. I think realizing that you can bring stuff in to supplement what you're doing sometimes to create some interest in the space that you've got. Yeah, great. So let's move on. We'll have a quick look at, so if you think of any, I'll bring the chat bit up. If you think of any questions as we go on with this, feel free to just type them in the chat bit and we'll make sure we cover those before the end of the session. Oops, sorry, keep skipping ahead. Chat. So this unit is the Woodland unit's a slightly shorter unit, and can be done, most of it can be done without having to have delivered sessions, that kind of thing. But it's quite nice with some of the questions to sort of reference some of the things that might have gone on with some of your groups. So some of them you might think, well, I could maybe make a start on that, but I might want to wait. There's obviously a bit down there which is talking about explaining ways to involve your participants in looking after their woods or trees. So obviously you need to have done some work on that first. So it talks, the language that this is in isn't that friendly necessarily. So I haven't written this. This is what I've been given to work with. So I give you the guidance which basically indicates what I'm looking for. So it talks about what you will need to demonstrate, and what you'll need to be able to write about or show in some way. So some of these questions need a longer answer than others. So the key word often is the first few words, and then maybe the sort of detail of what it's asking for. So if we've got something like, that's quite a good one, I suppose, identify there. So the bit that says identify a range of woodland fauna and flora for own, what does it say next? Can't see that. Own site. There we go. Detailing, identifying characteristics for each species. So what that is trying to get you to look at is it's trying to get you to look at creating some sort of guide. So you've got to be able to show that you can identify that there's different things living in your woodland or in your space, or in a woodland, but particularly looking at your own site. But it could be a site you visit. So as Paulina mentioned, for her site, she preferred to probably be out in Baydock's Wood when she's looking particularly at nature and wildlife. But you might find nests and bugs and all sorts of things just in a garden space as well. But you need to create a little guide that's showing flora and fauna. So that's key there. And then talking about how you can help the children identify those species. So again, that's not, I give you a lot more than that, and we'll look at that in a minute. I give you a lot more guidance on what I need, like how many different types of birds I need, how many different types of insects I need you to sort of describe in your guide for the site or spaces you might use. The top question, so we'll have a quick look at that. So this whole compare. So obviously if we're comparing two spaces, we need a bit more detail here. We need some detail on, well, what is a broadleaf woodland and what is a coniferous woodland? What's the kind of ecosystem in those woodlands? And what are the physical structures and the types of the variety of life that you might find? So what that question is trying to get at is that we understand that some woodland is fairly natural, although it's obviously been managed by humans, and other woodland has been planted for a crop. So it's that we understand there's a difference between those things. So obviously you're going to need to do some reading. You're going to need a few sources of reference material for that, and it can be all online, that's fine. And you'll need to sort of look at writing in your own words. So that's the key point, is putting it into your own language. You know, don't use technical language. Put it in a language that makes sense to you to describe what the difference is between those types of woodland. Some of the other questions are a little bit more straightforward in that they're talking about, well, how are you going to get the children to look after your space in a sustainable way? How are you going to nurture a connection between the woodland and your groups as well? So some of those are a bit more straightforward. Yeah, in terms of evidencing things that have happened. So if for example, so thanks Deborah, yeah, looking at sort of how you evidence what's happened in a session and how you bring that in to your written answers, what I generally say is that the written work is best, not for all these questions. Obviously that first one there, you're not really referencing that much about the delivery of your sessions and your groups, but a lot of these questions work best where you've got a reference, maybe one or two references that relate to the sort of theory behind it, and then they're linked to what you've seen or experienced with your groups. So you can just literally say, oh, you know, on a recent session or on a session last week, or if it's part of your 6 sessions, everyone's going to be delivering 6 sessions that they evaluate as part of this. So it could be that you say, oh, on session 3, as part of my 6 sessions, we saw this particular wildlife, or we did a bug hunt and this happened, or we had the group building bug hotels and this is what the children experienced and this is what they said. So you can directly reference out of your observations and evaluations of those 6 sessions. You can just pull a chunk out of stuff you've written about what you saw and just bring it into these sorts of answers here. So you don't need to massively rewrite that, but obviously you need to relate it and make it specific to these questions. So yeah, do try and pull through your experience of what you see and what you experience with your groups, and link that into the sort of theory that you've read as well. So this is the guidance that I give you for written work. So this, yeah, again, it sort of reiterates that compare the structures and biodiversity. And then I've said this is quite a long answer or quite a detailed answer. So I've broken it down into different sections so you can see what I'm looking for. Often with some of these more technical questions, unless you're a woodland whiz or a tree nerd like me, you might often have to do quite a bit of reading to pick up on stuff, but showing that you've been reading and that you've referenced stuff is really good from the awarding body's point of view. They want to see that you've read around and you've thought about this and you've used some different sources of information. So it's asking, firstly, that could be done quite briefly in a couple of paragraphs. Again, for part of this question, if you wanted to do some of it in a table, you could do that. Some people have done that in the past where they've put at the top sort of broadleaf woodland and coniferous woodland, and then they've talked about what are the different things that you might find or see in those woodlands. So the fact that in a broadleaf woodland, trees are generally made up of their native trees that are generally deciduous trees. They have broad leaves, as that describes there. So that means they're not needle type that you'd find needles on coniferous type trees. So it's describing the broad differences, I suppose, between what is a broadleaf woodland and a coniferous woodland. And obviously, like I said, a lot of coniferous woodlands have been planted. Most of them really have been planted. Broadleaf woodlands can be planted as well. A lot of them have been. There's been a lot of new woodland planting in the last 20, 30 years. So we've got a lot of young, newly planted woodlands around. So describing that, and then going on and thinking about what are the key features that you might find in a UK woodland. So I've described some of that again, thinking about the vertical up and down layers. So what's going on below the ground, we've talked a little bit about that. What's going on at the ground level in terms of what may or may not be growing. Then the sort of, you know, we talked about moss, and again, that's a great one. That could be on the ground, that could be on the trees. And then looking up into the smaller trees. And like we were saying, in lower woods, there's you know, there's some great coppice there, so you get a really good shrub or understory layer. And then we've got the canopy, which would typically in somewhere like lower woods that you mentioned, that would be big trees like oak trees and ash trees and things like that. And then we've got also the other sort of features as well: paths, hedges, edges of woodland, open areas as well. And obviously in a more park-like space that's less like a woodland, we've got a lot more open areas. But some of those open areas are really good because you get lots of light in, lots of flowers, and that's really good for wildlife. So then it's looking at key differences from the point of view of light levels. So during the year, how the light levels vary as the leaves grow up and cover the canopy. Soil properties and how that varies in different spaces. Deadwood, which I talked about briefly, and then the kind of overall diversity. And I've asked up there for an example, giving an example of a food web. So generally in questions, so if you are looking at doing some referencing, so if you're doing some direct quotes, do use direct quotes, that's fine. If you're using a really long quote, then try and make sure it's very relevant. Obviously, I can't mark the quotes, but what the quotes and images can be useful for is referencing your the point that you're making or your written work. So for example, in here, you could have a food web that you found a picture of, or maybe you've decided to lay it out yourself and describe it yourself, to look at the different, you know, insects and plants and how things are connected up. And then it's about how you pull the information out of that quote and that reference. So obviously, if you do a long reference and you're pulling out, you know, lots of different bits of information from that, that's fine. Otherwise, keep references fairly short and keep them as tight and relevant as you can, because I can't mark the actual reference, but obviously the reference is really useful from the point of view of showing that you've done some reading, and really useful in demonstrating your knowledge and understanding of you know, what that reference means. And then I've done just a short conclusion at the end about how it feels different, you know, when you go into these different types of woodlands. So the main thing to focus on really with all this written work is not worrying about it. That is key. Do not worry about it. Better to get to a point where you think that's good enough and send the unit in. So when you complete a whole unit, you send it in. But if you're uncertain at any point when you're writing any particular question of what's needed, just get in touch with me. Just say, I'm not quite sure I understand this question or what you're looking for. That's fine. When you submit your unit of work, so if you submitted this woodland unit, once you've done all the different questions, if I need more information, I'll come back to you. So it's not, you don't, you know, just get one chance. It's fine. So don't worry about it. Better to sort of move forward with that. So that was just an image, and again, you could use that as a reference. That would be fine, because you could then talk about the different things that you could find in this image. So, you know, you can use images like that, even though it's not your work, because you can use them to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of what could be found in a woodland, the different types of sizes of tree, things growing in different areas of the woodland, having openings, having thicker areas, and where wildflowers might grow, the fact that they grow more in the open areas than under the trees. So that's fine. Yeah, you can definitely use those sorts of things. And again, this was just to highlight, obviously, plantation woodland starts off often with your like Christmas tree plantations, and grows into bigger trees. But often the variety of wildlife in there doesn't develop in the same way that it would develop in a native woodland. All sorts of reasons for that, partly to do with the pine needles that are falling down. They create a soil type that doesn't degrade or rot in the same way. So it's not as good for insects, which means you don't have the food webs developing in the same way. And just the conditions aren't really suited to a lot of native wildlife. in terms of things to eat. Obviously, there's a lot less insects that will feed on pine needles, even when they're green. And also, when these trees get planted and harvested, the ground gets compacted by the machinery that comes in to harvest them. So again, that affects the soil and the ecology and the ecosystem as a whole. So that was just to kind of highlight that. And just in terms of thinking about well-being and nature, there's something I'm quite kind of interested in at the moment. There's this idea of forest bathing, which has come out of Japan. It's been around for about 40 or 50 years. It's not a new idea in many ways, in that we know that being in green spaces is good for our well-being and our health for all sorts of reasons. But the thing that has developed in Japan, which is interesting, is the idea of a specific sort of walk, either providing spaces in woodlands or guided walks that include a lot of sensory and mindfulness experiences. Some of it's just sitting and listening. Some of it might be looking for particular colours. Sometimes I think some of the forest bathing that take place in Japan includes a tea ceremony, and it can include lying in a hammock or kind of sort of staring up into the canopy. And there's some proper research around this now that's sort of looking at those, what we were talking about earlier with those chemicals that are coming off leaves in woodlands that we know is happening anyway, but actually a lot of those chemicals coming off trees are actually really good for us. And that's just starting to be looked at scientifically, that there's these sort of aromatic, some of them are obviously smelly, I suppose, in coniferous woodlands, but less so sometimes in our native woodlands. But there's a lot of volatile sort of airborne chemicals coming off the trees, and actually we've evolved in sort of wooded areas and wooded landscapes and alongside trees, and actually a lot of those trigger our immune systems and are really good in terms of relaxing our nervous systems, but also in triggering a positive immune response as well. So yeah, we've got all sorts of stuff around the air in terms of coming off the trees and the cleanliness of the air, but also the chemicals that trees are releasing being good for us. So yeah, there's all sorts of well-being, I suppose, parts of being in a woodland or being around trees with children. Obviously, some of them they won't tune into at all, but they will kind of get that benefit from being outside and being in those spaces, as we do as well as adults. So yeah, what I was going to say really over the next sort of period between now and us meeting face to face in the woods is just try and use your senses as much as you can when you go out into woodlands, whether it's with your children, whether it's just on your own, or whether it's with groups you're working with. Really just try and focus into, I mean, a lot of the well-being sort of studies that have emerged in the last 10 or 20 years have looked at how being very present through using touch, sight, smell, hearing is so key to kind of just stilling our mind and relaxing our nervous system and putting us in a more meditative state. And although with children, sometimes that can feel quite frantic, because you might say, can you go and find me an orange leaf, or can you find me a stick that looks like this? And they'll frantically run off and be searching. That process of just honing in on a specific thing that they're doing in a natural setting just stills the rest of their mind. Children are quite good at that naturally. As adults, we find it harder. But it's something to really try and do more of yourselves, but definitely experiment with your groups on just seeing how they respond to very simple sensory-based experiences. I did one the other day with a group that was quite a lively, difficult group, same group that I had today actually. And I thought they're never going to go for this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I said, right, I want you to try and hold on to a tree for 2 minutes, holding the bark and not make any noises, and just tell me what you experience afterwards. And they were quite into it. It was quite surprising. Some of them made it 10 seconds, which, you know, was quite good for some of them. I think 10 seconds was a long time for them. But they still hung on to their tree, even though they were being a bit chatty. Some of them made it to the full 2 minutes, and they were really determined to make it to 2 minutes. And we talked a little bit afterwards, and they just said they'd never done that before, and that it was really interesting. It was cold, the bark was cold, and it was rough. And they were just more aware of the tree. So it was, yeah, I think sometimes just those very simple activities around just doing something you wouldn't normally do And I do, yeah, definitely encourage you just yourselves to try these things at points, because you'll find it's quite an interesting process just to really hone in on a particular kind of experience around trees, whether it's looking at leaves in more detail, looking at the bark in more detail, or just being next to a tree for a bit longer than you normally would. Not always easy if you've got children with you, or dogs that want to go on a walk, or people that are getting impatient. But if you can, then do. So that's pretty much it on that front.